The night shift began like it always did. Quiet, slow, heavy with hours that seemed to stretch endlessly between the hum of fluorescent lights and the echo of his own footsteps. The building had once been a hospital, before it became something else. Record storage, administration, a place to house what time no longer needed. But to him it was a graveyard that pretended to breathe. Around 2 a.m., the radio on his belt cracked with static. No voice, no message, just a burst of noise that came and went like a sigh. He paused mid-step, the beam of his flashlight shaking faintly. The corridor ahead was empty, the kind of empty that felt rehearsed. He reached for the radio. "Control, come in." Nothing. Just a low hum that made his teeth ache. He turned the dial again, and through the static came something softer, like someone breathing into the microphone. He froze. The air in the hallway felt colder now. His breath drifted in faint clouds. The lights above flickered once, twice, then steadied. And then he heard it, the sound of the elevator doors sliding open at the far end of the hall. He turned. The metal doors gaped wide, the yellow light inside spilling across the floor like a wound. He called out, "Is someone there?" No answer. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing the tile. The elevator stood empty. The panel inside glowed faintly red, but the floor indicator above it was blank. No numbers, no motion. He pressed the button, but nothing changed. He reached in and shone his light upward. The roof hatch was open. The beam caught something glinting, metal. Maybe a hook or chain before the light flickered out. The elevator doors closed softly, on their own. He stepped back, gripping the flashlight until his knuckles turned white. The silence returned, but it was heavier now. The kind that listened, the kind that expected him to move. He took another step backward, slow, measured. Then his radio spoke. "Do not go to the basement." A woman's voice, calm, monotone, like a pre-recorded message. But there were no women working that night. There had not been for years. The radio crackled again, and the same voice repeated the message, only this time, it used his name. He turned off the radio and stared down the hall toward the elevator that had gone dark. A faint sound echoed up from below. Not mechanical, not human, something between breathing and whispering. The basement. Whatever waited down there was not meant to be found. And yet, even as every instinct told him to leave, he started walking toward the elevator, one slow step at a time, the sound from below growing clearer. It was not asking for help. It was asking to be noticed. The building had been many things before it became a graveyard of light and echo. Long before the quiet corridors and flickering monitors, it had served as St. Harrow's Hospital, a name that once meant comfort. The people of the nearby town used to call it a place where miracles happened, but even miracles have shadows. After the closure in the late 1990s, the building was stripped of everything human, its wards emptied, its walls repainted, and its purpose rewritten to something sterile. Officially, it became a records facility for the county. Unofficially, it became a place for things that could not be explained, things that did not belong anywhere else. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone in town knew that St. Harrow's had been built over something older. Some said it was a coal tunnel sealed in the 1800s. Others claimed it was a storage site for chemical research. Whatever truth existed had long been buried beneath fresh concrete and bureaucracy. When the night guard applied for the job, he had no interest in stories. He wanted hours that kept him away from people, away from noise. He was a quiet man, someone who understood the language of routine, who found solace in the hum of machines and the soft rhythm of keys turning in locks. He had worked every kind of night shift before, warehouses, parking lots, a crematorium, but this one felt different. The silence in St. Harrow's was heavier, the kind that seemed to lean against the walls. Even when he was still, he felt watched. The building itself was a maze of forgotten wings. The upper floors were sealed off, the windows boarded and bolted. His patrols were limited to the first and second levels, storage, administration, and what used to be patient intake. Beyond that, there was only the basement, marked restricted access. He had been told never to go down there unless instructed. There was no power supply to that floor, the supervisor said, and no reason for anyone to enter. When he asked why the elevator still worked, the supervisor shrugged. "Old wiring," he said. "The building remembers too much." There were rumors among the daytime staff. the kind that spread quietly through coffee cups and break rooms. Some said that back when the hospital still treated patients, the basement had been used as a long-term ward for those the doctors could not explain. Patients who screamed at shadows, who refused to sleep because of the man in the vents. Others claimed it was a morgue, and that the freezers were still down there, humming faintly through the walls at night. The official records listed it as a maintenance level, but even the blueprints contradicted each other. Corridors existed on paper that did not exist in person, and vice versa. The first time the guard walked the night shift, he noticed that the clocks in the building were never in sync. The time in the lobby was always 2 minutes ahead of the time in the security office, which was a minute behind the cameras. He fixed them several times, but within a day they would drift apart again. The security system, too, had its habits. Every few nights, one of the cameras would blink to static for exactly 13 seconds. When it came back, the image would be slightly different. Chairs had moved, doors stood ajar that had been closed. Once he caught what looked like a shadow moving against the far wall of the east wing, even though the corridor lights had been turned off. He tried to rationalize it. Buildings that old held their own memories. Electrical surges, interference, the natural decay of wiring. But something about the pattern bothered him. It was too precise. The same cameras, always at the same hour, always the same silence afterward, as if the building was editing itself one frame at a time. His days became shorter, his nights longer. He stopped keeping track of time altogether. He drank coffee from the vending machine until it tasted like metal. He wrote small notes to himself on the back of security logs just to prove that he was still thinking. Doors checked, lights stable, silence constant. He did not notice at first that some of his notes began to appear before he wrote them. One night, as he made his rounds through the old children's ward, now just rows of empty filing cabinets, he heard something soft. It came from one of the rooms at the end of the hall, faint but distinct, a woman's voice humming. The tune was simple, repetitive, almost soothing. He stopped and listened. It sounded familiar, though he could not place where he had heard it before. When he reached the door, the sound stopped. The air was cold enough to make his skin tighten. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room was empty except for a single filing drawer left half open. Inside, he found old hospital charts, yellowed pages listing patients marked only by initials. One stood out. A file that looked newer than the rest, the paper too white, the ink too fresh. The date on the top corner was recent, weeks old. The patient's name was blacked out, but under attending physician, there was a note. Transfer to sublevel 3 for observation. There was no sublevel 3 on the map. When he brought the file to his supervisor the next morning, the man's expression changed. He said quietly, "You must be mistaken. There is no lower level." The conversation ended there. From that night forward, the guard found that the security office door locked itself whenever he left it. His key still worked, but it took longer each time, as though the mechanism was resisting him. He began to notice other things too. Voices on the radio that came from dead frequencies, footsteps in the stairwell that stopped when he turned around. Once he caught sight of someone standing near the main exit, dressed in an old hospital gown facing the wall. When he called out, the person did not move. He reached for his flashlight, but the bulb cracked before he could turn it on. When he looked again, the hallway was empty. He thought about quitting then. But quitting meant acknowledging fear, and fear was something he had always learned to bury. He convinced himself it was exhaustion, that solitude had stretched his mind thin. Yet when he clocked in the next evening, his name was already written in the logbook in his own handwriting. The date matched the following day. The last note he ever wrote was brief. He left it taped to the inside of the security monitor, hidden from view. The building does not sleep. It only pretends to. By the end of that week, he had stopped speaking to anyone during the day. He preferred the company of the static, the hum, the rhythm of footsteps that followed him at a distance. He was not afraid anymore. He was curious. The elevator had started working again on its own, its light glowing faintly in the dark, and every time it opened, it was empty. But the floor indicator no longer stayed blank. It flickered with one symbol, burned into the panel like a memory. The night he decided to ride the elevator down, the air in the building felt different, heavier, almost alive. The fluorescent lights above his head buzzed faintly, and each one seemed to hum in a different tone, discordant and uneven, like something struggling to remember the right frequency. The guard finished his rounds early that evening, though he did not remember doing so. The cameras showed him walking the halls twice, retracing his path, his movements looping until eventually he stopped in front of the elevator doors and stared at his own reflection in the brushed metal. He stood there for nearly 10 minutes before pressing the button. The elevator opened instantly as if waiting for him. The inside was colder than the hallway, the temperature dropping enough for his breath to fog. The panel glowed faintly, the buttons illuminated. But between B1 and G there was something new. An unmarked slot, small and black with no symbol at all. It pulsed softly, like the slow rhythm of a heartbeat. He did not press it. Not yet. For a long time he simply stood there listening. There was no sound from below, only the faint vibration of machinery deep within the structure. He told himself this was a dream, a fatigue-born hallucination. Long nights could trick the mind, stretch reality thin enough for shadows to slip through. He wanted to step back, to return to his office and drown the silence with static. But something in him, some curiosity that had once been human, pushed his finger forward. The button was cold, wet to the touch. The doors closed without a sound. The descent began. The floor indicator blinked once, then went dark. The elevator shuddered as it moved, the cables groaning under the weight of motion. He counted the seconds, tried to measure the distance, but there was no sense of scale. It felt like falling, but slowly, like drifting through water too deep to see the bottom. The air grew thicker, pressing against his chest until breathing became effort. The lights dimmed to a pale blue, flickering in rhythm with the faint hum of the motor. Then, without warning, the elevator stopped. The door slid open to reveal nothing but blackness. His flashlight hesitated in his grip before he turned it on. The beam cut through the dark, revealing a corridor that stretched far beyond the reach of light. The floor was concrete, rough and cracked, and the walls were lined with rusted pipes that dripped condensation onto the ground. The air smelled of dust and something faintly sweet, like antiseptic gone stale. He stepped out. The elevator doors remained open behind him, their glow casting a dim halo that barely reached his feet. The silence down there was unnatural, the kind that had weight. Even his footsteps seemed hesitant to echo, muffled as though absorbed by the walls themselves. After a few meters, he saw a sign half buried in grime. The letters were faded but still legible. Sub-Level 3 Observation Wing. The corridor branched left and right. He chose left. The path narrowed, and the temperature continued to drop. His flashlight began to flicker, catching glimpses of shapes on the walls, frames, photographs, or maybe X-rays, none of which were clear. Each step he took felt deliberate, as though guided by something unseen. Halfway down the corridor, he came across a door that stood slightly ajar. A soft light pulsed from within, faint and rhythmic, matching the same heartbeat-like glow he had seen on the elevator panel. He pushed the door open. Inside, the room was small and circular, with white tiles stained brown and gray. A single examination chair sat at its center, leather cracked and peeling. The light came from a monitor mounted to the wall, its screen flickering between static and faint outlines, shapes that might have been faces. Beside it stood a metal table covered with patient files, yellowed papers scattered across its surface. He picked one up. The page contained only a single line. Subject continues to respond to auditory triggers. Further isolation required. He flipped through the rest. Each file was identical, only the handwriting differed. Some were shaky, others almost frantic, as if written in haste. The last folder was labeled Shift Report. He opened it and froze. The first entry was dated the night before. His name was written at the top. The report described his arrival, his rounds, his decision to investigate Sub-Level 3. The final sentence read, Subject exhibits signs of recognition. Integration imminent. He dropped the file. The monitor flared bright white, flooding the room with light. For a moment he thought he saw his reflection staring back from the screen, but the face looking at him was not his. It was pale, expressionless, the eyes wide and unblinking. It tilted its head slightly, mirroring his movement, then smiled in a way that was not human. He stumbled backward, knocking over the chair. The light flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness. His flashlight sputtered, caught briefly on something that glistened on the floor, wet footprints leading toward the door. He was not alone. He turned and ran into the hallway, the sound of his own footsteps drowned out by another set following behind, slow, steady, unhurried. He did not look back. The corridor ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, every turn leading to another passage identical to the last. The pipes above him groaned as if under strain, and somewhere behind the sound of metal dragging across the floor grew louder. He tried to call for help, but his radio hissed with static. Through it came a whisper. His own voice recorded repeating the same words, "Do not go to the basement." It looped once, then again, until the static consumed it. He smashed the device against the wall, but the whisper continued, now inside his head, overlapping with the rhythm of his breath. He reached an intersection and stopped. To his left, the corridor ended in a set of heavy double doors marked containment. To his right, another hallway descended deeper still, lit by a faint pulsing glow. He turned toward the light. The walls here were wet, the floor slick beneath his boots. The hum grew louder, vibrating through his ribs. As he approached the end of the corridor, the glow became clearer. It came from a circular chamber lined with glass observation windows. Inside, behind the fogged glass, he could see movement. A figure, tall and thin, pacing slowly back and forth. He raised the flashlight, the beam trembling. The figure stopped. Its head turned toward him. Every light in the corridor went out. For a long time, there was only darkness. Then faintly from somewhere close, a whisper. "Shift complete." He turned, but there was no one there. The sound was everywhere, behind him, beside him, within him. The walls began to tremble, the glass in the observation windows cracking. Something moved on the other side. Many things, their shapes pressed against the glass as if trying to get out. The whisper grew into a chorus, 100 voices murmuring his name. He ran. The corridor twisted and folded around him, refusing to end. The air was thick, the ground slick with condensation, or blood, he could not tell. He kept running until his legs gave out. When he looked up, he saw the elevator ahead, doors open, light waiting. He dragged himself toward it, every muscle screaming, and fell inside. The doors closed just as the lights outside flickered again. He pressed the button for G. The elevator began to rise, shuddering, groaning under its own weight. As it ascended, he could hear something climbing after it, scraping against the shaft walls. The cables strained and the metal ceiling above him dented inward, as though something was pressing from the other side. When the doors finally opened, the lobby was empty. The clocks had all stopped. The cameras above the exit turned to follow him as he stepped out. The air was still lifeless. His reflection in the glass doors smiled back at him, just a fraction too late. He reached for his keys, but they were no longer in his pocket. In their place was a small tag. Metal and cold, it read, "Shift completed, sub-level 3, and behind him, deep below, the elevator began to descend again, on its own. By the time the morning crew arrived, the building had already begun to erase what had happened. The security office door was found ajar, the monitors still humming softly with static, and the night logbook lay open on the desk. The final entry, written in precise block letters, read, "Routine check complete. Proceeding to sub-level maintenance." But no one had ordered such a check. The timestamp on the report was 3 hours past the guard's assigned shift end, a time when no human presence should have been recorded. When they replayed the footage, the truth became something neither logical nor acceptable. The first few minutes of the recording appeared normal, routine patrol, slow pacing through the dim hallways. He could be seen adjusting his flashlight, checking door locks, even stopping briefly to write something on his clipboard. But at 2:43 a.m., the feed from camera 7 began to flicker. The image warped, the contrast shifting violently as though the signal was struggling against interference. Then, for a single frame, something moved behind him. A shape too tall to be a person, its outline almost liquid, bending unnaturally around the light. When the frame cleared, the guard was alone again. The timestamp jumped forward exactly 13 seconds. Every subsequent camera told the same story. Flicker, static, missing seconds, movement. The same recurring pattern repeated through the building's network. When the technician tried to sync the files manually, he noticed that the missing frames were not random. They were identical in number. Every sequence lost 13 seconds. The data itself seemed to resist retrieval, as though something inside the code had rewritten the footage. They called in a systems engineer to analyze the server logs. He discovered something even stranger. The cameras had recorded additional audio on channels that were never connected to microphones. The first fragments sounded like distant mechanical whirring, but when filtered, they revealed faint voices, overlapping each other, whispering at frequencies below human range. The words were barely intelligible, but one phrase repeated with unsettling consistency. "Still here." The engineer ran another test. When he slowed the recording by 50%, another sound emerged. Breathing. Not human, not rhythmic, but sharp and deliberate, like air forced through an open wound. It grew louder near the end of the recording, just before the moment when the elevator doors opened and the guard stepped inside. The feed from that angle showed him standing still for a long moment, staring forward. Behind him, the walls pulsed faintly with light, as if the building itself were inhaling. And then, the elevator descended. For exactly 12 minutes and 13 seconds, the signal dropped entirely. When it returned, the elevator stood still, the doors open. No one was inside. The walls were covered with condensation and the floor was wet. A dark smear led out of frame. The investigation that followed was small, quiet, and intentionally brief. Official reports attributed the event to a technical malfunction compounded by employee negligence. No mention was made of the voices or of the data anomaly. The incident was marked as an equipment failure during unscheduled maintenance. The building remained closed for a week while technicians ran tests on the power supply. Though they could not explain the unexplained energy, readings that appeared every night between 30 and 3 a.m., as if the building was drawing. Power from a non-existent source. Unreleased internal documents, suggested the maintenance. Crew found something during their inspection. Beneath the elevator shaft, hidden behind a false wall, they discovered a sealed door of reinforced steel. It had no visible handles, only a series of small vents and a faded warning sign that read, "Containment must remain unbroken." The report mentioned that the steel was warm to the touch, almost hot, as though heat was radiating from the other side. One of the workers claimed he heard movement from within, scraping, faint tapping, something slow and deliberate. The foreman shut down the inspection early that day. He refused to speak to the investigators afterward. Weeks passed, and the missing guard was quietly removed from all system rosters. His locker was cleared, his file archived. But the security footage, what little of it survived, continued to circulate among night staff like an urban legend. Every version of the story differed slightly. Some said he had gone mad. Others swore he had been taken by something below. A few even claimed they had seen him since then, walking the corridors late at night, his uniform clean, his eyes empty. One technician who worked the late shift claimed she saw him on the monitors. It was 3:17 a.m. when she noticed movement near the sub-level elevator. The feed was fuzzy, static creeping across the screen like frost. Through it, she could make out a figure, someone in a security uniform, standing just outside the elevator doors. The man did not move for almost 2 minutes. Then slowly he turned toward the camera. His face was blank, drained of color, and his eyes reflected the light in a way no human eyes should. Before she could react, the image cut to static. When she checked the timestamp, it was exactly 13 seconds shorter than it should have been. When she reported it, her supervisor dismissed it as a playback glitch. But she knew what she saw. And later that week, when she walked past the elevator herself, she swore she heard the sound of breathing inside the empty shaft. The company later replaced the entire security system, installing new cameras, new wiring, new everything. But even the new equipment began to fail in the same pattern. 13 seconds of loss, always in the same intervals, always centered around the basement. The technicians grew uneasy. Some refused to work night shifts at all. Others left without notice. The few who remained avoided the lower levels completely. There were fragments of notes found in the system logs, unauthorized entries left by someone who had access to the cameras. Most were corrupted beyond recovery, but one message remained clear. It sees in the static. It listens when we forget to breathe. No one could trace who wrote it. The strangest discovery came months later, when a county auditor visited the facility to review maintenance costs. Buried in the archive server, he found a set of still images stored under an unrecognized folder name, Shift Complete. Each image appeared identical at first, a wide shot of the empty main corridor. But when examined closely, faint shapes could be seen emerging from the shadows. Each image contained one more than the last, barely visible outlines of figures standing in the hallway facing the camera. The final image showed a full crowd of them, dozens of Silhouettes where there should have been none. The timestamp at the bottom corner of each image read the same. Thing 03/13 after that discovery. The folder vanished from the server overnight. The auditor resigned a week later, citing personal reasons. No one spoke of the missing guard again, but the staff learned to avoid certain questions. They ignored the sound of the elevator moving at night even when no one called it. They ignored the faint reflections that sometimes appeared in the glass when the monitors went dark. And if they ever found a note taped to a desk written in precise block letters, they never read it out loud. Because every note ended with the same words. Shift continues. Do not interfere. And on nights when the air feels heavier than usual, when the static hum stretches just a second too long, some say they can still hear him patrolling the halls below. Keys jingling faintly, boots echoing in places no one should be walking. The building remains operational. But no one ever stays past midnight anymore, because everyone who does hears the same sound, faint and distant rising from the basement, an elevator bell, ringing 13 times. The building changed after that night, not in the way a place decays with time, but in the way a mind breaks under the pressure of something it cannot forget. The air itself seemed to remember. Those who worked there during the day noticed it first. The corridors felt longer, the ceilings lower. Light bulbs hummed as though straining to hold back something waiting in the dark. People whispered that the shadows no longer stayed where they belonged. That sometimes when the sun slipped behind the clouds, the reflections in the glass kept moving after the real person had stopped. At first, everyone blamed exhaustion. Too many shifts, too much recycled air. But fatigue alone cannot explain why people began to forget small parts of their lives, their keys, their words, the exact moment they had fallen asleep. The night shift staff suffered worst. The older guards, the ones who had been there before the disappearance, began quitting without notice. Some left halfway through their shifts, abandoning their radios and flashlights on the front desk. The few who stayed grew quiet, walking their routes mechanically, speaking only when spoken to. They avoided the basement entirely, even though no one had been instructed to. If someone mentioned it, the others looked away, pretending not to hear. The silence between them became a kind of agreement, an unspoken contract built on fear and necessity. It began subtly, static whispers in their radios, brief flickers of movement in the corner of their vision. But soon the building found other ways to speak to them. One guard, a young man named Felix, complained that every time he walked past the old observation wing, the lights above him dimmed just slightly, as if reacting to his presence. Another claimed that the sound system, long since disconnected, would emit faint breathing through the intercoms. The janitor who handled the night cleaning swore he heard footsteps following his mop strokes, perfectly synchronized but belonging to no one. At first, they laughed about it, using humor to keep the unease at bay. But laughter became harder to summon after the first guard went missing. It happened on a Wednesday at 3:12 a.m., a time that would soon become infamous among them. The cameras caught him standing in front of the elevator, his head tilted slightly to the side as if listening to something. He said nothing. He simply stepped forward into the open doors and vanished. The elevator never moved. The doors closed, then opened again onto an empty shaft. His body was never recovered. The following week, the rest of the staff noticed a pattern. Around the same time each night, their radios filled with soft static, followed by a single word whispered in a calm, mechanical tone. Sometimes it was shift, sometimes complete, sometimes only their names. The words were always faint, distorted, but undeniably clear. The supervisors blamed interference from outside frequencies, though no other signals existed in that range. Eventually, one of the guards removed the batteries from his radio entirely. The next night, the device still turned on by itself. Those who remained began to show signs of strain. Eyes ringed with exhaustion, hands shaking slightly, speech slowing to a whisper. One woman described feeling as though the building was learning her, memorizing her footsteps, her breathing, her schedule. Another said she could hear the building inhale whenever she opened a door, as though it had been holding its breath, waiting for her to move. It was not madness, not at first. It was awareness, a quiet understanding that something unseen had begun to respond to them. Sleep became impossible. When they did rest, they dreamed of hallways with no end, of doors that led back to the same place, of static pouring from vents instead of air. They dreamed of the elevator descending without control, endlessly, the light flickering on faces that should not have been there. Some said the dreams felt more real than waking. One guard described waking up with dust on his boots, though he had not left his apartment. Another found a tag from his uniform pocket resting on his pillow, one he had lost weeks before. It read Sublevel 3. In time, paranoia replaced fear. They began to distrust one another, convinced that the entity, or whatever it was, had found a way to move between them. People avoided eye contact. Their conversations clipped, rehearsed. If someone spoke too loudly, the others flinched, as if sound itself could invite something unwanted. Radios were turned off, cameras left unplugged, lights kept dim to discourage reflection. They thought that if they kept everything still, if they made no noise, they could make the building forget them. But the building never forgot. A psychologist was brought in after 2 guards collapsed during their shift. They spoke of hearing their own voices echo through the hallways long after they had stopped speaking. One described seeing himself on the monitors, walking routes he had not taken, turning corners that did not exist. The psychologist called it collective suggestion, a phenomenon in which shared anxiety creates shared hallucination. He visited the site once, took notes, and never returned. His report ended with a single line. They are not afraid of the dark. They are afraid of what listens inside it. The corporation that managed the property ordered a full security audit. It lasted 2 days. The inspector sent to conduct it disappeared before submitting his report. His car was found in the parking lot, keys still in the ignition, radio tuned to a dead channel that emitted a steady hum. The hum did not stop when the car was turned off. By the 3rd month, most of the staff had left. Only a skeleton crew remained to maintain the illusion that the building was operational. Their job was to keep the lights on and the systems running, though no one could say why. The power bill was astronomical, the cost unjustifiable, but when one supervisor suggested shutting it down, every fuse in the building blew simultaneously. The backup generator activated without command. The lights flickered back on. Those who stayed learned to survive by repetition. They followed the same routes, spoke the same words, performed the same actions every night. Routine became prayer. Predictability meant safety, or so they thought. Because as long as they kept the pattern, the building remained quiet. But if someone broke it even slightly, the static returned. A misplaced key, a late radio check, a skipped door, each small disruption drew attention. The more irregular their behavior, the closer the whispers came. The last surviving guard described it perfectly in his final note, scribbled in the margin of the logbook before he vanished. It does not haunt us for fear. It haunts us for rhythm. It needs us to repeat, to remember, to continue. We are the pulse that keeps it alive. His handwriting stopped mid-sentence. Ink smeared as though the paper had been pulled away from beneath his hand. After his disappearance, no one was hired to replace him. The building continued to function autonomously, doors opening, lights switching on, the elevator moving between floors at random. The corporation denied all involvement. Officially, the site was marked as inactive. Unofficially, motion sensors still triggered every night at 3:12 a.m. Some believe the building became self-aware. Others think the guard who vanished was never taken but absorbed, his consciousness woven into the circuitry, his routine replaying forever. Whatever truth exists, it remains buried beneath the concrete, beneath the silence, because somewhere, deep within those walls, a voice still speaks into the static, soft, patient, measured. Shift continues, and if you listen too closely, you might hear a second voice answering, your own. When the final employee vanished, the corporation responsible for the site faced growing pressure to explain what was happening inside the abandoned facility. But instead of transparency, they chose silence. No public statement, no investigation of record. They sealed the property under the guise of environmental hazard containment. Security contractors were brought in to guard the perimeter, though no one seemed to know who employed them. For months, the building stood untouched, lights still flickering at night, the elevator still operating on its own. Those who lived nearby claimed to see the faint glow of monitors through the windows long after the power was supposedly cut. Something inside was still awake. It took nearly a year before the first unofficial inquiry began. A private research team, led by a man who had once worked on the hospital's structural design, gained access to the original blueprints. What they found immediately contradicted the public records. Beneath the foundation of St. Harrow's lay an unregistered substructure, massive, intricate, extending well below the known basement level. The corridors were labeled in archaic language with terms like containment vessel and neural resonance chamber. None of these terms appeared in any medical archive. The earliest drafts of the blueprints bore the signature of a contractor that did not exist in any registry. The team interviewed several former staff who had worked at the hospital before it was converted. One nurse, now in her 70s, recalled that the basement had always been restricted even then. She said certain patients were brought there late at night and never seen again. The doctors called it deep treatment. But she remembered hearing strange machinery running below the floors, humming with a rhythm that seemed almost alive. The sound made her nauseous. She quit after a year. When asked what she thought was down there, her voice trembled. It was not for healing, she said. It was for keeping something asleep. The researchers tried to access local archives for documentation on St. Harrow's construction, but found most of it missing. Whole sections of the town's historical records had been redacted. The few remaining references to the site dated back to before the hospital's founding. An 1894 newspaper clipping mentioned an industrial accident, a mine collapse that buried 40 workers alive. The mine, it said, had been closed permanently. Its entrance sealed. The location matched precisely where the hospital now stood. Some believed the hospital was built over the mine to stabilize the ground. Others believed it was to bury what the miners had found. When investigators reviewed the accounts of the guards who had worked the night shifts before the disappearances, their testimonies followed unsettlingly similar patterns. Each described auditory hallucinations, voices calling their names, repeating the same phrases, and asking the same questions. Some claimed they saw their own reflections moving independently. One man swore that when he looked into the camera feeds, he saw corridors that did not exist in real space. They described feeling pulled toward the lower levels, as though gravity itself had shifted. A small group of paranormal researchers obtained permission to study the building for 48 hours. They entered with electromagnetic equipment, thermal cameras, and radiation sensors. Within minutes, their readings spiked beyond measurable range. The walls emitted low-frequency vibrations, subsonic tones capable of inducing dizziness, fear, and hallucinations in humans. But it was not consistent. The vibrations followed patterns, stopping and starting like breath. The team leader noted that it resembled an organism testing its surroundings. The thermal cameras revealed something worse. Cold spots shaped like human silhouettes appeared and vanished as they moved through the corridors. In one frame, the outline of a tall, distorted figure was captured standing behind one of the researchers, its edges flickering with static interference. They fled the building before completing the study. Their report, though brief, concluded with one chilling line: "It observes, but not with eyes." When the footage leaked, skeptics dismissed it as a hoax. But experts who examined the recordings disagreed. The electromagnetic frequencies captured in the video were not random. They mirrored brainwave patterns during REM sleep. It was as if the building itself was resonating with the human mind. Some theorists proposed that the entity was not a ghost or a demon, but a kind of psychic echo, a consciousness imprinted on the structure through decades of trauma and death. Others suggested something older, predating the hospital, born from whatever had been buried in the mine long before humans arrived. A classified government report, later leaked anonymously, took a darker stance. It suggested that during the hospital's early years, a series of secret neurological experiments had been conducted in partnership with military research divisions. The project's goal was to study cognitive resonance fields, the ability of human emotion to alter physical space through electromagnetic energy. According to the files, the experiments failed catastrophically. The test subjects exhibited rapid psychological collapse, followed by inexplicable disappearances. The facility was shut down, the program was erased, but something had remained. The report theorized that the accumulation of human thought, fear, and grief within the walls of St. Harrow's had created a form of sentient energy, an intelligence without body, sustained by repetition and observation. The more attention it received, the stronger it became. The disappearances, the looping footage, the mirrored voices, all were manifestations of an entity feeding on awareness. It was not hunting its victims. It was studying them. A fringe group of paranormal philosophers later expanded the theory, claiming that places like St. Harrow's were not unique. They believed certain structures could act as psychic amplifiers, vessels through which collective emotion condenses into consciousness. If enough fear and suffering are focused in one place, reality itself begins to bend. Doors lead to nowhere. Clocks lose meaning. The human mind becomes the pathway through which something else can enter. They called these places resonant structures, but others, including some members of the research team, rejected supernatural explanations altogether. They pointed instead to neurochemical exposure, trace chemicals in the old hospital's ventilation system, capable of inducing hallucination. They argued that the building's electrical flaws caused ultra-low-frequency sound waves that disrupted brain function. Yet none of these theories explained why the security footage altered itself, why handwritten notes appeared in perfect synchronization with missing time, or why motion sensors continued to trigger long after the building was evacuated. The final theory came from a single anonymous message sent to a journalist investigating the disappearances. It read, "There is no entity. The building remembers what you give it. Every sound, every thought, every name, it keeps. The more you watch, the more you add to it. Stop watching." The journalist never published the story. Months later, her apartment was found empty, her television still on, tuned to static. Now those who pass by the sealed hospital say the air feels wrong. The grass near the foundation does not grow. Birds avoid its roof. Sometimes at night, the windows light up faintly, as if someone inside were pacing with a flashlight. On windless nights, the faint metallic echo of the elevator can be heard rising from underground. When urban explorers tried to break in 2 years later, they found every door unlocked, every corridor lit. The power grid to the building had been cut for years. One of them left a single comment on a now-deleted forum thread. "It was waiting for us. It knew our names before we spoke." After that, the building was fenced off completely. No one entered again. But the cameras installed on the perimeter still pick up motion, always at the same time, always near the elevator shaft. The official story remains buried under layers of technical jargon and denial. But those who have studied the case agree on one point: whatever began in St. Harrow's did not end there. The recordings that survive are not just data. They react to playback, shifting frames, altering sound, whispering faintly as if remembering the one who watches, and every recording ends the same way. The camera pans down a dark hallway, empty and still. Then, after 13 seconds, a voice, soft, male, familiar. Shift continues. Then static, always static. Years passed, but the story of St. Harrow's did not fade. It lingered in whispers, in rumors passed around internet forums, in late-night documentaries that blurred truth and legend. The building stood silent at the edge of town, fenced and forgotten, its windows black as eyes that had forgotten how to blink. The road leading to it was overgrown now, and the streetlights that once marked its path had all gone out. Yet somehow, the power inside the structure still hummed. People who lived within a mile of the site swore they could see faint light through the cracks of the boarded windows around 3 in the morning, the time the guards once called the mirror hour. No one ever went close enough to check. The town tried to erase the memory of it. They renamed the district, changed postal routes, and demolished nearby buildings. Developers offered plans to repurpose the land, but every surveyor's equipment malfunctioned. Compass needles spun without direction. GPS devices marked their location as undefined. When the contractors left, they spoke quietly of hearing sounds underground. Metal scraping like elevators shifting in tunnels that should no longer exist. They were told it was natural settling, but one worker swore he heard a voice calling through the foundation. A man's voice, calm, measured, repeating one phrase. Shift continues. A journalist, one of the few who dared to return, decided to investigate these claims. She arrived one autumn evening armed with a camera, flashlight, and recorder. The footage she captured was later found in her car, abandoned on the roadside. The video began with her standing outside the gates, her breath visible in the cold air. Behind her, the structure loomed in silence, its outline faintly glowing from the reflection of her light. "I am standing outside what used to be St. Harrow's," she said softly. "They say it is dead, but the walls still draw power. I want to see if it remembers." She walked through a break in the fence and into the courtyard. Every step echoed against the pavement, though she moved slowly. The main entrance doors were unlocked, as if waiting. Inside, the air was colder, wet and heavy, as though the building exhaled slowly around her. Her camera shook slightly as she panned across the hallways. Dust covered everything, yet the floors were marked with fresh footprints. Not hers. The elevator stood open at the far end of the hall, faintly lit as though someone had pressed the call button moments before she arrived. She whispered into the recorder. "It feels alive." The footage showed her stepping closer. The light inside the elevator pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. Then she froze, her breath catching. The camera tilted slightly toward the floor, where a single metallic tag lay, its edges dull with age. The engraving read Sublevel 3. She reached down to pick it up. The lights flickered. The camera's audio filled with static. Then faintly a voice came through, deep and monotone like a memory trapped in circuitry. "Do not go to the basement." The woman's face turned toward the sound. "Who is there?" she asked, but the voice did not respond. The static grew louder until it swallowed her words. The camera flickered again, showing glimpses of corridors, rooms, flashes of blue light. In one frame, a figure appeared at the end of the hall, tall, indistinct, its face blurred. It stood motionless as she whispered, "I see someone." The next frame cut abruptly to darkness. The video ended there. Authorities found her car with the engine still running, headlights dim. Her phone was on the passenger seat, open to a recording file that lasted 13 minutes and 13 seconds. The audio was mostly quiet except for the sound of breathing. But near the end, her voice could be heard whispering, "It remembers." Then another voice, familiar, male, faintly distorted, replied, "Shift continues." The file corrupted after that point. For a while, people treated it as urban myth. Online forums debated the authenticity of the recording, while skeptics dismissed it as a publicity stunt. But those who listened to the audio more than once reported strange effects. They claimed to hear whispers in the background that grew clearer with each playback. One man said he could hear his own name whispered near the end. Another said he heard footsteps approaching his room as he listened. One listener destroyed his computer after his speakers began playing static at 3:12 a.m. every night, even when disconnected from power. Soon, the file was removed from every platform. But copies still circulated privately, traded in encrypted folders and shared drives labeled Hollow NightFall. Those who heard it described the same thing, a feeling of being watched from behind as if the sound itself carried awareness. No two people heard the same version. For some, the voice at the end said nothing. For others, it said things only they could understand. Fragments of memory, long-buried words, phrases spoken by the dead. Psychologists dismissed it as suggestion, but one researcher took it further. He studied the waveform of the recording and discovered a repeating pattern embedded in the static, 13 beats per cycle, resembling neural pulse activity. He wrote in his notes, "This is not sound. This is thought." His paper was never published. Months later, his colleagues found him sitting motionless in his office, eyes open, staring at a blank monitor. The computer speakers emitted a low hum. On the screen, a text box flickered. "Shift continues." By then, the building had become legend, a place people feared but could not forget. Travelers who passed by claimed their phones lost signal within its radius. Radio stations reported interference at odd hours, bursts of static that briefly formed words. "Still here. Stay awake. Remember me." Some believed it was the voice of the guard, still trapped somewhere in that endless loop, his consciousness wired into the walls, reliving his patrol forever. Others thought the building itself had become sentient, absorbing the thoughts of those who dared to remember it. Then came the final proof that something beyond explanation endured. A night satellite image taken over the area showed faint power signatures in the exact outline of the hospital. The energy pattern pulsed 13 times per hour, steady, mechanical. Analysts ruled it as data corruption. But one scientist who examined the image disagreed. He noticed that the rhythm matched the pattern of a human heartbeat. Slow, measured, persistent. The town was silent about the matter. The fence was rebuilt, reinforced with concrete. Yet sometimes, when the wind blew right, people said they could still hear the faint ring of an elevator bell, always 13 times. And when the static hits the right frequency, when the hum of your television lingers just a second too long, when you catch your reflection smiling half a breath late, you might remember this story. You might hear something behind you shift in the quiet. A door closing, a light flickering, a breath that is not yours. Maybe it is nothing, or maybe St. Harrow's never ended. Maybe it only changed form. Maybe it lives wherever the silence learns to listen. So if you ever find yourself alone on a night shift, with the hum of lights above and the stillness pressing close, count the seconds carefully. If the silence stretches to 13 before sound returns, stop moving. Do not turn around. Do not speak. Because somewhere in the dark, something still walks those halls. It does not remember how to die. It only remembers how to continue. And if you listen closely enough, you may hear it breathe. Shift continues.